Tonight, you are about to begin a long, quiet journey through time, memory, and place. This is not a story that asks for urgency, and it is not a history lesson meant to be memorized. Instead, this is a gentle unfolding of the past, told slowly and calmly, allowing your thoughts to soften and your body to rest as the story moves forward at an unhurried pace. What you are listening to is a documentary sleep story designed to be experienced with ease. It moves carefully through centuries of change, not focusing on noise or drama, but on atmosphere, daily life, and the steady rhythm of time passing. This is a story meant to accompany rest, whether you remain awake and listening or drift into sleep somewhere along the way. Tonight's journey explores the long and layered past of Virginia, a land shaped by rivers and forests, by coastlines and mountains, by early human presence, settlement, struggle, growth, and quiet endurance. This story does not rush from one moment to the next. It pauses where needed. It allows space between events. It respects the natural flow of history, just as it respects your need for calm. This video is titled The Entire History of Virginia, Sleep Story and Documentary, and it has been created with intention. You do not need to remember dates, names, or details. If your attention wanders, let it wander. If your breathing slows, allow it. And if sleep arrives before the story reaches its end, that is not a mistake. That is exactly how this story is meant to be experienced. The narration you will hear is intentionally slow, even, and smooth. It is designed for long listening, quiet evenings, late nights, and moments when your mind needs rest rather than stimulation. You may listen actively, following each sentence as it unfolds, or you may allow the voice to fade gently into the background while your body relaxes. There is no correct way to listen here. There is only a calm way. As the story begins, you will be guided back to a time before modern life. You will hear about natural landscapes that existed long before cities and borders, about early indigenous life, about exploration and settlement, about moments of hardship and resilience, and about the gradual shaping of a place over centuries. Each chapter connects naturally to the next, creating a continuous flow that is ideal for sleep, rest, or quiet reflection. This is not a story built on tension. It does not seek to surprise or overwhelm the mind. Instead, it focuses on routine, environment, and the slow movement of time. History here becomes something gentle, something that moves beside you rather than demanding attention from you. If at any point you lose track of where the story is, that is perfectly fine. You do not need to rewind. You do not need to concentrate harder. Simply let the words continue. The structure of this story is designed to carry you forward softly, whether you are awake, half asleep, or fully asleep. This video is part of the Past Asleep channel, a space created for those who enjoy history told softly, without urgency, without noise, and without stress. Here, the past is not something to rush through. It is something to move through slowly, like a long walk through familiar landscapes at dusk. These stories are meant to be companions during quiet hours, helping you unwind after long days and guiding you toward deeper rest. If you find comfort in this kind of storytelling, you are warmly invited to support the channel. A simple like helps more people discover these calm history journeys. Subscribing allows you to return whenever you need relaxation, comfort, or sleep. And if you feel like sharing your thoughts, leaving a comment is always welcome, whether you stayed awake through the entire story or drifted off somewhere along the way. As this journey begins, take a moment to settle in. Adjust your position if needed. Lower the volume to a comfortable level. Let your shoulders relax. Allow your breathing to slow naturally. There is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to go. This story does not require effort. It asks only that you allow it to unfold. As the history of Virginia moves gently forward, let the present moment soften around you. Let the past become a quiet background, and let rest arrive whenever it chooses. Thank you for spending this peaceful time with Past to Sleep. Sweet dreams, and enjoy the journey. Number 1. The ancient natural landscape of Virginia, long before the land carried a name, long before maps, borders, or human memory shaped its meaning, the place that would one day be known as Virginia, existed in a state of quiet balance. Time moved gently here, without urgency or direction. There were no years to count, no moments to record. Change unfolded slowly, guided only by the rhythms of earth, water, wind, and light. This land was shaped over immense stretches of time by powerful natural forces working patiently beneath the surface. Deep within the earth, pressure and movement gradually lifted sections of land upward, forming hills, ridges, and distant mountains. These formations did not rise suddenly. They emerged layer by layer, shaped by forces unseen, taking form across millions of years. What would later be called the Appalachian Mountains slowly took shape, their peaks once sharp and tall, later softened by age and weather. Water played an equally important role in shaping this ancient landscape. Rivers began as small movements, gathering strength as rain and melting ice fed them. Over time, they carved paths through soil and stone, creating valleys and fertile plains. These rivers did not rush. They wandered, bending and turning according to the land's natural contours. The James, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, and countless smaller waterways flowed quietly, long before they were ever named. To the east, the land gradually lowered, meeting the wide presence of the Atlantic Ocean. Here, the coastline formed slowly, shaped by tides, storms, and shifting sediments. Bays, inlets, and marshlands appeared where land and sea met gently rather than abruptly. The Chesapeake Bay began to take form, not as a fixed boundary, but as a living, changing body of water that expanded and contracted with time. The climate of this ancient world followed steady, repeating cycles. Long periods of warmth were followed by colder ages, and then warmth returned again. These shifts were gradual, giving life time to adapt rather than disappear. Ice ages brought cooler temperatures and changing ecosystems, but glaciers never fully covered Virginia. Instead, they influenced rainfall, vegetation, and animal movement indirectly, shaping the land through balance rather than destruction. Forests slowly spread across much of the region. Trees grew where soil and moisture allowed, forming dense woodlands filled with towering hardwoods and evergreen stands. Oak, maple, pine, and other species established themselves over time, their roots anchoring the soil and creating layered ecosystems beneath their canopies. Fallen leaves enriched the ground, allowing new growth to emerge season after season. In open areas, grasslands and meadows formed, shaped by sunlight, fire, and grazing animals. These spaces were never static. They expanded and shrank depending on climate and natural disturbance. Fire, sparked naturally by lightning, played a quiet role in renewing the land, clearing old growth and allowing fresh life to rise again. These fires were not constant or destructive, but part of a larger cycle of renewal. Animal life moved through this landscape freely and without boundary. Large animals traveled across forests and plains, following instinctive routes shaped by water, food, and season. Smaller creatures filled the undergrowth, burrowed into soil, and nested among trees. Birds followed the changing seasons, arriving and departing in quiet patterns that repeated year after year. Each species existed in relationship with the land and with one another, maintaining balance through adaptation rather than dominance. Sound in this ancient Virginia was gentle and layered. Wind passed through leaves and tall grass. Water moved steadily over stone. Rain fell softly, soaking into the ground. Animal calls echoed briefly, then faded. Silence was not empty here. It was full of subtle motion, of life unfolding without haste. Light shaped daily rhythm even before life learned to measure it. Sunlight filtered through forest canopies, shifting slowly across the ground. Dawn and dusk arrived gently, without artificial interruption. Night brought darkness rich with stars, unbroken by human light. The sky itself felt vast and present, changing gradually with the seasons. The land did not exist to be used or claimed. It did not anticipate arrival or transformation. It simply existed, complete in its own form. Rivers flowed without purpose beyond movement. Mountains stood without needing to be crossed. Forests grew without needing to be cleared. Everything followed its own internal rhythm, guided by natural law rather than intention. Erosion worked patiently across centuries, softening stone and reshaping hills. Rain carried soil gently from high ground to low, nourishing valleys and riverbanks. Nothing here happened quickly. Change was constant, but it was subtle, almost imperceptible within a single lifetime. As thousands of years passed, this landscape remained resilient. It absorbed storms, shifts in climate, and gradual geological change without losing its balance. Life adapted, ecosystems adjusted. The land learned how to bend without breaking, how to change without losing itself. This was Virginia before memory, before footsteps, before voices, before story. A land shaped by time rather than ambition. A place where nature spoke softly but continuously, guiding everything through patience and repetition. As you imagine this earliest chapter, picture endless forests stretching beneath wide skies. Feel rivers moving steadily toward the sea. Sense the quiet strength of mountains resting in the distance. Let your thoughts slow to match the pace of the land itself. This was the ancient natural landscape of Virginia, unclaimed, unhurried and whole, resting calmly as time flowed on, waiting quietly for the next chapter to begin. As time continued its long and patient movement across the land that would one day be called Virginia, the ancient natural world deepened into a state of quiet continuity. Nothing here rushed forward. Nothing resisted change. The land existed in an ongoing conversation between earth, water, air, and light, a conversation that unfolded so slowly it could only be felt across generations of life rather than moments. The forests of this region grew thicker and more complex as centuries passed. Trees that had once stood alone gradually became part of vast layered ecosystems. Tall hardwoods reached upward toward the sky, their branches spreading wide and filtering sunlight into soft patterns below. Beneath them, younger trees, shrubs, and plants found space to grow, creating a dense living structure that supported countless forms of life. Each layer of the forest served a purpose, from the highest leaves to the deepest roots. These forests were not static. Storms occasionally passed through, bringing strong winds or heavy rain. When a tree fell, it did not represent loss, but opportunity. Sunlight reached the forest floor, allowing new plants to emerge. Fallen trunks slowly returned nutrients to the soil as they decayed, feeding the next generation of growth. This cycle repeated endlessly, teaching the land how to renew itself without disruption. Rivers continued to shape the land gently but persistently. Their paths shifted slightly over time, responding to rainfall, erosion, and the gradual movement of soil. During wetter periods, rivers expanded beyond their banks, flooding nearby plains and depositing rich sediment. When waters receded, these floodplains became fertile spaces where plant life thrived. These cycles of overflow and retreat shaped some of the most productive landscapes in the region. Wetlands formed where water lingered, creating marshes and lowlands that supported unique ecosystems. These areas filtered water naturally, slowing its movement and allowing sediments to settle. They became places of quiet abundance, filled with plant life adapted to saturated ground. Animals visited these wetlands regularly, drawn by food, shelter, and water. Life here moved at a slower pace, shaped by stillness rather than flow. To the east, the coastal plain continued its gradual transformation. The Chesapeake Bay expanded slowly as rising sea levels flooded ancient river valleys. Saltwater mixed with fresh water, creating brackish environments that supported diverse life. Tides moved in steady rhythm, reshaping shorelines grain by grain. Storms occasionally altered the coast, but even these changes were absorbed over time, smoothing into the land's long memory. The climate continued its slow cycles of warming and cooling, These shifts did not arrive suddenly, they unfolded over centuries, allowing forests to migrate gradually and animal populations to adjust their ranges. During warmer periods, plant life expanded northward. During cooler times, growth slowed and ecosystems contracted slightly. The land adapted through movement rather than resistance. Animal life responded to these changes with quiet intelligence. Large mammals followed established routes shaped by generations of instinct and memory. They moved with the seasons, seeking food and shelter without exhausting any single area. Smaller animals adapted through burrowing, climbing, or remaining still during harsh conditions. Birds followed long migration paths, returning each year with remarkable consistency. Predator and prey existed in careful balance. No species dominated completely. Population shifts occurred naturally, regulated by availability of food and habitat. This balance prevented extremes, allowing ecosystems to remain resilient across long periods of time. Survival here was not about conquest, but about adjustment. Fire continued to play a subtle but important role. Natural fires, often sparked by lightning, moved slowly through certain areas, clearing undergrowth and encouraging new plant life. These fires did not consume everything. They moved in patches, leaving much of the forest intact. Afterward, the land recovered quickly, often richer and more diverse than before. Fire became another tool through which balance was maintained. Sound remained soft and meaningful. Wind moved through leaves and across open land. Rain fell gently, sometimes steadily, sometimes briefly. Rivers murmured as they passed over stone. Animal sounds appeared and disappeared, marking moments rather than dominating space. Silence was common and comfortable, allowing awareness to stretch wide. Light continued to shape rhythm without interruption. Seasonal changes altered the angle and intensity of sunlight. Summers brought longer days and slower evenings. Winters shortened daylight, encouraging rest and stillness. Night skies remained dark and expansive, allowing stars to shine clearly. These cycles taught patience through repetition. The soil itself grew richer with time. Layers of organic matter accumulated as plants lived, died, and returned to the earth. This soil held moisture and nutrients, supporting increasingly complex ecosystems. Roots spread deep and wide, anchoring the land and preventing erosion. Even during heavy rains, the land absorbed water gently, releasing it slowly into streams and rivers. The mountains, though ancient, continued to change almost imperceptibly. Erosion softened their peaks, rounding sharp edges and deepening valleys. Stone moved grain by grain, carried by water and wind. These changes were not dramatic, but they were constant. The mountains stood not because they resisted time, but because they moved with it. Despite all this movement, the land retained coherence. Forests did not overwhelm rivers. Rivers did not erase valleys. Each element existed in relationship with the others, maintaining balance through cooperation rather than dominance. The landscape functioned as a whole, greater than the sum of its parts. There were no boundaries here, no lines drawn across forest or field. Space belonged to movement and season. Life flowed freely across the land, guided by instinct and environment rather than ownership or control. Memory existed only in patterns, migration routes, growth cycles, erosion lines. There were no stories yet, no spoken history. The land remembered itself through form rather than words. Every river bend, every soil layer, every forest edge held traces of what had come before. As thousands of years passed, this ancient Virginia remained largely unchanged in spirit. It adapted continually, yet it did not rush toward transformation. It existed fully in the present, carrying the past gently and allowing the future to arrive without force. As you imagine this stage of the land's story, picture forests breathing softly in the wind, rivers moving steadily toward the sea, light shifting slowly across hills and valleys. Feel the calm of a place that does not hurry and does not resist. This was Virginia continuing its ancient life, patient, balanced, and enduring. A land shaped not by sudden events, but by time itself, moving quietly forward, preparing, without knowing it, for the arrival of footsteps, memory and story still far beyond the horizon. As deep time continued its steady unbroken flow, the land that would one day be called Virginia settled into a mature and enduring balance. This was a world shaped not by sudden change, but by endless repetition, seasons following seasons, growth following rest, motion followed by stillness. The land did not strive to become something new, it simply continued to be, complete in its own quiet way. Forests covered much of the region, stretching across rolling hills, valleys and lowlands. These forests were ancient in character, shaped by generations of growth and renewal. Towering trees stood alongside younger ones, creating a layered canopy that softened light and sound. Sunlight filtered through leaves in shifting patterns, never harsh, always gentle. Beneath the trees, the forest floor remained cool and alive, covered in fallen leaves, moss and rich soil. These forests changed slowly over time. Individual trees lived long lives, rising gradually and returning gently to the earth when their time ended. When one fell, it opened space rather than creating absence. New life filled the gap naturally. The forest was never empty, never overcrowded. It adjusted continually, maintaining balance through quiet exchange. Rivers continued to serve as the land's slow-moving memory. Their waters followed familiar routes shaped by gravity and terrain rather than intention. Some rivers moved calmly through wide floodplains, while others curved through wooded valleys. Their banks supported dense plant life, and their waters carried nutrients from upland forests toward the sea. These rivers did not rush. They moved with confidence, shaped by time rather than urgency. Seasonal flooding enriched the land rather than damaging it. When rivers overflowed, they spread life-giving sediment across nearby plains. When waters receded, fertile ground remained, supporting thick growth. This cycle repeated endlessly, creating landscapes of quiet abundance that required no intervention to remain productive. Wetlands expanded and contracted naturally, responding to rainfall and seasonal change. These spaces existed between land and water, neither fully one nor the other. They supported unique forms of life adapted to stillness and moisture. Birds gathered here during migration. Animals visited regularly. Plants thrived where water lingered. Wetlands slowed movement, encouraging patience and calm. To the east, the coastline continued its gradual transformation. Rising seas reshaped river mouths, forming wide bays and tidal estuaries. The Chesapeake Bay grew into a vast living system where fresh water and salt water mixed gently. Tides moved in predictable rhythm, advancing and retreating without force. Shorelines shifted subtly over centuries, shaped by water rather than conflict. The climate remained generally mild compared to harsher northern regions, yet it still followed natural cycles of variation. Winters encouraged rest and conservation. Summers supported growth and movement. Spring and autumn served as transitions, moments of adjustment rather than disruption. These rhythms allowed ecosystems to thrive without strain. Animal life moved through this world with practiced awareness. Large mammals followed established paths shaped by memory and instinct. Their movement prevented overuse of any single area. Smaller animals adapted through shelter, speed, or stillness. Birds connected distant regions through migration, arriving and departing with remarkable consistency. Predator and prey relationships remained balanced. No single species overwhelmed the land. Population shifts occurred gradually, regulated by food availability and habitat, rather than sudden collapse. This balance allowed ecosystems to remain stable across long periods of time. Fire continued to play a quiet role in maintaining health. Natural fires cleared dense undergrowth in certain areas, encouraging new plant growth and maintaining open spaces. These fires were not destructive forces, but part of the land's renewal process. Afterward, life returned quickly, often stronger and more diverse than before. Sound remained subtle and calming. Wind moved gently through leaves. Water flowed steadily over stone. Rain arrived softly, sometimes lingering, sometimes brief. Animal sounds appeared in moments, then faded again into silence. There was no constant noise, no interruption to the land's natural rhythm. Light continued to guide life gently. Daylight shifted with the seasons, altering behavior without urgency. Long summer evenings allowed extended activity. Short winter days encouraged rest and reflection. Night brought darkness free of artificial light, allowing stars to shine clearly across open sky. The soil deepened with each passing generation of plant life. Layers of organic material accumulated, holding moisture and nutrients. Roots spread wide and deep, anchoring the land and preventing erosion. Even during heavy rain, the soil absorbed water patiently, releasing it slowly into streams and rivers. The mountains, ancient and worn, remained steady on the horizon. Though erosion softened their shapes over time, they retained their presence. Valleys deepened gradually, slopes rounded gently. Stone moved slowly, shaped by persistence rather than force. Despite constant motion, the land remained unified. Forests, rivers, wetlands, mountains, and coastlines existed in relationship with one another. No single element dominated. Balance emerged through cooperation, not control. There were still no boundaries here. No ownership. No division. Space belonged to movement, season, and life itself. Paths formed where animals traveled repeatedly, then faded when movement changed. Nothing was fixed permanently. Memory existed only in form and pattern. There were no stories yet, no spoken names. The land remembered itself through growth rings, sediment layers, and eroded stone. Time was recorded silently, without witness. As thousands of years passed, this ancient Virginia remained deeply stable. It adapted continuously, yet it did not hurry toward change. It existed fully in each moment, carrying the past gently and allowing the future to approach at its own pace. As you imagine this final stage of Virginia's ancient natural world, picture endless forests under calm skies, rivers moving steadily toward the sea, hills resting quietly in soft light. Feel the deep stillness of a place that does not rush and does not resist. This was Virginia before history, before footsteps, before memory became story. A land shaped by patience, guided by balance, and held together by time itself. Resting calmly, complete and enduring, as the long silence continued, waiting quietly for the first human presence to arrive and listen. Number 2. Indigenous peoples and early native life of Virginia. Long before written records, borders, or permanent settlements appeared, the land that would one day be called Virginia became home to human life that arrived quietly and adapted patiently. The first people did not come to reshape the land, but to live within it, guided by observation, memory, and respect. Their presence unfolded slowly, shaped by the same natural rhythms that governed forests, rivers, and seasons. These early inhabitants arrived over long stretches of time, likely following natural routes formed by changing climates and landscapes. Movement was never rushed. Families and small groups traveled gradually, guided by availability of food, water, and shelter. When conditions allowed, they moved forward. When the land required rest, they paused. This patience became a defining feature of early life in Virginia. The environment offered both abundance and challenge. Dense forests provided wood, shelter, and wildlife. Rivers supplied fresh water and fish, while also serving as natural pathways across the land. Coastal areas and estuaries offered access to marine life and fertile ground. The land did not give everything easily, but it offered enough to those who learned how to listen. Early communities developed deep knowledge of seasonal cycles. Spring marked renewal when plants emerged and animals became more active. Summer brought warmth, longer days, and opportunity for travel and gathering. Autumn was a time of preparation, harvesting, and storage. Winter encouraged stillness, reflection, and conservation of resources. Life followed this rhythm without resistance. Food gathering formed the center of daily life. Hunting required patience and skill, guided by knowledge passed down through generations. Animals were tracked not aggressively, but attentively. Fishing followed seasonal patterns, especially in rivers and coastal waters where fish returned reliably each year. Plants, roots, nuts, berries, and seeds were gathered carefully, never stripped completely from an area. Nothing taken from the land was wasted. Every part of an animal had purpose, whether for food, clothing, tools, or shelter. This careful use ensured balance and allowed resources to replenish naturally. Excess was discouraged not through rule but through shared understanding of consequence. Shelter reflected adaptation rather than permanence. Homes were constructed from materials readily available: wood, bark, reeds, and earth. These structures provided protection from weather while remaining flexible. Some were used seasonally, others for longer periods, depending on local conditions. When communities moved, the land was allowed to recover fully. Clothing was shaped by environment and necessity. Animal skins and plant fibers provided warmth and protection. Designs emphasized comfort, movement, and durability, rather than decoration alone. Over time, techniques improved through experience, ensuring survival in both cold winters and warm summers. Community life was built on cooperation. Survival depended on shared effort rather than individual success. Tasks were divided naturally, with roles adapting to age, ability, and season. Knowledge was shared openly. Elders guided through experience, offering wisdom without authority imposed by force. Learning occurred through observation and repetition. Children grew into responsibility by watching daily life unfold. Skills were practiced gradually, refined over time. Mistakes were corrected gently, reinforcing patience rather than fear. This approach created confidence rooted in understanding rather than urgency. Spiritual life was woven into everyday existence. The land was not separate from people. Rivers, forests, animals, and weather were understood as living forces deserving respect. Rituals and traditions honored these relationships, reinforcing balance rather than dominance. Life was not owned, it was participated in. Movement across the land followed natural paths. Rivers guided travel inland. Trails formed where footsteps repeated, then faded when routes changed. There were no fixed roads, no permanent boundaries. Space remained fluid, shared, and responsive to need. Time was not measured in numbers, it was felt through seasons, events, and memory. Years were remembered by notable winters, abundant harvests, or shared journeys. This way of understanding time kept attention grounded in the present while honoring the past. As generations passed, distinct cultures and languages emerged across the region. Differences reflected geography rather than separation. Coastal groups lived differently from those inland. River communities developed practices suited to their environment, yet all shared a common foundation: respect for balance and patience. Trade developed naturally between neighboring groups. Goods, tools, and ideas moved slowly along known routes. Trade strengthened relationships and shared knowledge rather than encouraging accumulation. Exchange was based on trust and reciprocity. Conflict was limited and generally resolved through tradition and dialogue. Resources were managed through shared understanding, reducing competition. Balance mattered more than expansion. Stability mattered more than control. Health and healing were approached holistically. Physical well-being was inseparable from mental and spiritual balance. Healing practices combined knowledge of plants with ritual and community support. Illness was understood within the broader context of life, rather than as an isolated problem. Artistic expression existed quietly within daily life. Tools, clothing, and shelters often carried patterns or symbols reflecting identity and environment. Art served purpose as much as beauty, strengthening connection rather than standing apart from function. Sound in this world remained gentle. Conversation was calm. Activity followed need rather than schedule. Silence was familiar and comfortable, allowing awareness to remain wide and responsive. This early stage of indigenous life in Virginia unfolded without urgency and without written record. Yet it was rich with knowledge, resilience, and quiet strength. The land and its people shaped one another through long relationship, building cultures grounded in patience rather than speed. As you imagine this first chapter of human life in Virginia, picture small communities moving calmly through forests and along rivers, fires glowing softly at dusk, voices low and purposeful, the land vast and steady around them. This was not conquest, not expansion, but belonging. Human life entered Virginia gently, learning to listen before acting, to adapt before changing, and to move in harmony with a land already complete. Laying the foundation for cultures that would endure for thousands of years, long before new influences arrived to alter the course of history as time continued its slow and steady movement across the land. Indigenous life in Virginia entered a period of deep refinement rather than dramatic change. Generations lived and passed, each one adding quiet understanding to the knowledge already carried forward. Life was not shaped by sudden discoveries, but by patient observation repeated over centuries. What worked was remembered, what disturbed balance was gently set aside. Communities became deeply attuned to long-term patterns. Elders remembered seasons that stretched far beyond a single lifetime, years of abundance, years of scarcity, winters that tested preparation, summers that brought renewal. These memories guided decisions, helping communities know when to move, when to stay, and when to prepare more carefully. Time was not something to race against, it was something to move with. Children grew into responsibility naturally. Learning was woven into daily life rather than separated from it. Young people watched how food was gathered, how tools were made, how shelters were repaired. They learned by doing, repeating tasks slowly until skill replaced effort. Mistakes were part of learning, corrected with patience rather than urgency. Knowledge grew quietly, rooted in experience rather than instruction alone. Social bonds strengthened through shared work. Hunting, fishing, planting, building, and preparing food were often communal activities. Working together reduced risk and reinforced trust. No one lived entirely apart from the group. Cooperation was not optional, it was the foundation of survival. Through shared effort, relationships deepened and stability endured. Seasonal movement continued to guide life. Spring brought renewed activity as rivers swelled and plant life returned. Summer allowed travel, trade, and extended gathering. Autumn focused attention inward, preparing food and materials for colder months. Winter brought stillness, storytelling, and reflection. Each season had its place. None was rushed, none was resisted. Agriculture slowly developed alongside hunting and gathering in many areas. Crops were grown with careful attention to soil, weather, and timing. Fields were not forced into productivity, they were tended patiently, allowed to rest when needed. Farming existed as partnership with the land rather than domination of it. Crops supplemented traditional food sources, adding stability without replacing established practices. Trade networks expanded quietly. Goods, tools, materials, and stories moved between communities along rivers and trails. These exchanges strengthened connections rather than encouraging accumulation. Trade was based on trust, reciprocity, and long-standing relationships. Its purpose was balance, not wealth. Health and healing remained holistic. Physical well-being was inseparable from mental and spiritual balance. Knowledge of medicinal plants was passed down carefully, refined through observation and experience. Healing involved community support as much as technique. Illness was not faced alone. It was shared, understood, and addressed collectively. Decision-making followed tradition and consensus. Leaders emerged through experience, wisdom, and respect, rather than authority enforced by power. Guidance was often offered indirectly, allowing individuals to arrive at understanding themselves. This approach preserved harmony and prevented division. Language carried deep meaning. Words were shaped by environment and experience, allowing precise expression of natural processes, relationships, and memory. Stories preserved history, teaching lessons about respect, survival, and balance. Oral tradition kept the past alive without fixing it in rigid form. History remained flexible, adapting to each generation while retaining its core truths. Spiritual life continued to be inseparable from daily routine. The land was not an object to be used, but a presence to be respected. Animals were honored for their role in sustaining life. Rivers were treated as living paths rather than resources alone. Rituals reinforced gratitude and humility, reminding people of their place within a larger system. Conflict remained limited and carefully managed. Disagreements were addressed through dialogue and tradition rather than force. Maintaining balance mattered more than winning. Community stability took precedence over individual desire. Art and craftsmanship evolved quietly. Tools, pottery, clothing, and shelters carried patterns and designs that reflected identity and environment. Art was not separate from function. It enhanced daily life, adding meaning without excess. Despite hardship at times, fear did not define life. Preparation, shared knowledge, and memory reduced uncertainty. Even during difficult seasons, communities relied on cooperation and patience rather than panic. Hardship was met with calm endurance. As centuries passed, indigenous cultures in Virginia became deeply rooted and resilient. They did not remain unchanged, but they remained balanced. Adaptation occurred without losing identity. The land and its people continued to shape one another through quiet exchange. As you imagine this stage, picture a calm evening near a river, smoke rising gently from cooking fires, soft voices sharing stories, children resting nearby, the forest steady and protective around them. This was life shaped by belonging, by memory, by patience. Indigenous peoples of Virginia created cultures of quiet strength and understanding long before outside influence arrived. Their knowledge was not written in books, but carried in movement, story, and care for the land. And as time continued forward, this wisdom endured, rooted deeply in place, ready to adapt once again when new forces eventually approached the horizon. As indigenous life in Virginia continued to unfold across centuries, it entered a stage marked by deep stability rather than dramatic change. This was a world where knowledge no longer needed to be discovered. It needed to be remembered, protected, and passed forward. Life moved with confidence born of long experience. The land was no longer something to learn for the first time. It was something intimately known. Communities carried memory across generations, not through written record, but through shared living. Elders remembered stories told to them as children, stories that described not only events, but proper ways of being. These stories carried guidance about weather, animals, cooperation, and restraint. They were repeated not to preserve the past, but to prepare the future. Children grew surrounded by rhythm. They learned the land by walking it, learned the seasons by living through them, and learned responsibility by watching others carry it calmly. There was no sharp divide between learning and life. Every moment offered instruction. Every task carried meaning. Movement across the land became instinctive. Paths were not marked, yet they were known. Rivers guided travel inland and outward. Forest clearings were revisited across generations. Seasonal camps returned year after year, shaped more by memory than design. The land itself became a map, readable to those who listened. Food systems remained carefully balanced. Hunting followed tradition, not impulse. Fishing respected timing and return. Agriculture, where practiced, worked alongside natural cycles rather than against them. Fields were allowed to rest. Forests were not stripped. The land was trusted to provide again if it was not exhausted. Periods of hardship occurred, but they were met with preparation rather than fear. Long winters were expected. Poor harvests were remembered from earlier times and planned for. Shared storage and communal support reduced suffering. No one was entirely alone in difficulty. Community was the strongest protection. Spiritual understanding deepened with time. The natural world was not divided into sacred and ordinary. Everything belonged to the same living system. Rituals were not performed to control outcomes, but to acknowledge connection. Gratitude was practiced daily, not reserved for ceremony alone. Leadership remained fluid and situational. Those with experience guided decisions when needed, then returned to shared life without separation. Authority did not harden into power. Respect was earned through wisdom and care rather than command. Trade and communication between groups strengthened regional stability. Knowledge moved as freely as goods. Warnings about harsh seasons, shifts in animal movement, or environmental change traveled along these networks. This communication allowed communities to adjust without crisis. Language continued to evolve, reflecting intimate relationship with environment. Words described subtle changes in weather, land, and life. Meaning was precise, shaped by necessity. Storytelling preserved identity while allowing adaptation. The past was honored without imprisoning the present. As centuries passed, this way of life became deeply rooted. It did not require expansion. It did not demand conquest. It sought continuity. The land and its people existed in quiet agreement, each shaping the other through patience rather than force. There was no sense of waiting for something else. Life was complete as it was. The future was not imagined as improvement, but as continuation. Change, when it came, would be met as change always had been, with observation, restraint, and calm adjustment. As you imagine this final phase of early Indigenous life in Virginia, picture a peaceful dawn over forest and river, mist lifting slowly, a village beginning its day without urgency, the land breathing softly around it. This was life before disruption, before borders, before ownership replaced belonging, a world grounded in balance, memory, and respect, carried forward quietly through generations, ready, without knowing it, to face changes that would one day arrive from far beyond the horizon. Number 3. First European exploration and early contact in Virginia. As Indigenous life in Virginia continued in its calm and well-balanced rhythm, changes began to stir far beyond the horizon. These changes were not felt immediately, nor were they anticipated by the people living among forests, rivers, and coastlines. The land itself remained steady, unchanged by distant curiosity. Yet slowly, quietly, attention from across the ocean began to drift toward this part of the world. In distant lands, maps were incomplete, and imaginations were active. Unknown coastlines invited speculation rather than certainty.
The world beyond familiar shores was viewed as possibility rather than place. For those who sailed outward, the journey itself was uncertain, shaped by weather, limited knowledge, and hope rather than understanding. When ships eventually moved toward the Atlantic coastline of what would later be called Virginia, they did so cautiously, guided by curiosity more than confidence. The first European explorers arrived not as settlers, but as observers. Their ships appeared briefly along the coast, rising and falling with the tides. From the water, the land looked vast and quiet. Forests stretched inland without visible end. Rivers opened wide mouths toward the sea, inviting movement inward while revealing little of what lay beyond. The scale of the landscape dwarfed the small vessels offshore, creating a sense of humility rather than control. Early contact was limited and tentative. Explorers often remained close to their ships, unsure of terrain, climate, or inhabitants. They observed from a distance, noting shoreline features, river openings, and natural harbors. Maps were sketched imperfectly, shaped by brief glimpses rather than deep knowledge. What they recorded captured outlines, not understanding. For Indigenous communities, these first encounters were moments of curiosity rather than alarm. Outsiders appeared briefly, dressed differently, speaking unfamiliar sounds, carrying objects unlike anything seen before. Yet these appearances were temporary. Ships arrived, lingered, and departed again. Life on land continued uninterrupted. Seasons still guided movement. Food still needed gathering. Preparation for winter still mattered more than distant visitors. Communication between groups was limited and uncertain. Gestures replaced shared language. Observation replaced explanation. Each side studied the other quietly, without immediate conflict or trust. These early moments did not yet carry the weight of transformation. They were simply encounters, noticed, remembered, then absorbed into existing understanding of the wider world. European explorers often misunderstood what they saw. The absence of visible cities or permanent stone structures led them to underestimate the complexity of Indigenous life. They saw forests and rivers as unused rather than carefully managed. This misunderstanding shaped their reports, which traveled back across the ocean carrying incomplete impressions. The land itself slowed deeper exploration. Dense forests resisted easy passage. Rivers curved unpredictably. Tides and storms complicated movement along the coast.
Without indigenous guidance, inland travel was difficult and often abandoned. These limitations ensured that early contact remained shallow and brief. Motivations for exploration varied. Some sought trade routes, others sought territory. Others simply followed instruction from distant authorities, yet all were constrained by environment. Virginia did not reveal itself quickly. It demanded patience, something few early explorers fully possessed. As years passed, repeated voyages increased familiarity without intimacy. Certain coastal features became recognizable. River mouths were revisited. Harbors were noted. Still, the interior remained largely unknown to outsiders. The heart of the land stayed quiet and untouched, protected by scale, forest, and distance. For indigenous peoples, these encounters were integrated into oral tradition. Stories of strange ships and unfamiliar people were shared calmly, without urgency. Outsiders were noted as part of a wider world, not yet as agents of change. Life continued according to long-established rhythm. Time moved forward gently. Exploration did not yet become settlement. Curiosity did not yet become control. The land remained dominant, guiding interaction through restraint rather than resistance. As you imagine this stage, picture wooden ships resting offshore at dawn, fog lifting slowly from water, forests standing silent beyond the shore. On land, daily life continuing, fires lit, food prepared, movement unhurried. This was the beginning of awareness, not occupation. The first distant glance, not arrival. Virginia remained what it had always been, vast, patient, and deeply alive. While the outside world slowly learned of its existence, touching its edges lightly as time continued to move forward, calm and unbroken. As time moved forward, European contact with the land that would later be known as Virginia slowly became more frequent, though it remained cautious and incomplete. The coastline was no longer entirely unfamiliar, and certain rivers began to appear repeatedly in journals and memory, yet familiarity did not bring control. The land continued to set the pace, revealing itself only in fragments and never all at once. Ships returned, season after season, guided by partial maps and repeated experience. Sailors began to recognize the curve of the shoreline, the rhythm of the tides, and the shelter offered by certain bays. Even so, each journey carried uncertainty. Weather shifted without warning, storms altered routes, fog erased landmarks. The Atlantic crossing itself remained dangerous, reminding explorers that distance was not easily overcome. Contact with indigenous communities increased gradually. Meetings became slightly more regular, often taking place near rivers or open shorelines where movement was natural. These encounters were shaped by observation and patience rather than shared language. Gestures, tone, and repetition carried meaning where words could not. Understanding developed slowly, built on familiarity rather than explanation. For indigenous peoples, these repeated encounters did not immediately signal threat. Outsiders continued to arrive briefly and depart again. Their presence did not yet disrupt seasonal cycles or daily routines. Hunting, fishing, planting, and gathering continued as they always had. The land still provided. Community still mattered more than distant visitors. Trade began to emerge quietly. Objects carried by Europeans, metal tools, beads, fabrics, were exchanged for food, guidance, or hospitality. These items were not valued for novelty alone, but for usefulness. They were assessed carefully and integrated gradually where they fit within existing practices. Nothing replaced tradition outright. Instead, small changes layered gently onto established ways of life. European visitors, however, often misread these exchanges. They interpreted hospitality as submission and trade as agreement. These misunderstandings shaped expectations that were not shared by indigenous communities. Where Europeans saw opportunity for expansion, indigenous peoples often saw temporary interaction. Inland exploration remained limited. Dense forests, unfamiliar terrain, and reliance on waterways slowed movement. Without indigenous guidance, travelers struggled to navigate beyond riverbanks. Paths were not obvious. Food sources were not easily identified. The land resisted intrusion through complexity rather than force. Reports sent back across the ocean reflected both fascination and confusion. Virginia was described as fertile and promising, yet also wild and unpredictable. Its people were often misunderstood, their societies simplified through unfamiliar perspectives. These accounts shaped future intentions, encouraging deeper involvement without full understanding. As contact increased, curiosity slowly shifted toward permanence. The idea of staying longer, of establishing a foothold, began to take shape in distant planning. This shift did not occur because the land invited it, but because distance encouraged imagination. Virginia became more than a coastline, it became possibility. For indigenous communities, life continued in balance, though awareness of change began to grow. Outsiders returned more often, their ships lingered slightly longer, their curiosity felt more focused. Elders observed these patterns carefully, folding new information into collective memory. Preparation mattered more than reaction. The environment continued to regulate interaction. Seasons limited movement, winters discouraged extended stays, summer heat and insects tested endurance, food shortages reminded visitors of dependence on local knowledge. These natural boundaries slowed the pace of change, allowing Virginia to remain largely itself. As you imagine this phase, picture repeated arrivals along familiar shores, small gatherings near riverbanks, exchanges carried out calmly, forests standing unchanged beyond the edge of interaction, life continuing inland without interruption. This was a time of deepening awareness, not yet domination, of repeated contact, not control. Virginia remained a land observed more than entered, known more through outline than understanding. The outside world leaned closer, curiosity growing steadier, while the land and its people continued at their own pace, patient, grounded, and guided by rhythms far older than distant ambition. As time continued to pass, the rhythm of contact in Virginia slowly shifted from occasional encounters towards something more sustained. The land itself did not change its pace, but human intention began to settle more heavily upon it. Ships arrived with greater regularity, their appearances no longer surprising. Familiar shapes on the horizon became expected rather than curious. With each return, the sense of distance narrowed, and the idea of permanence quietly took root. European visitors began to spend longer periods along the coast and near major rivers. Camps that were once temporary lingered into new seasons. Supplies were stored rather than consumed quickly. Tools were repaired instead of discarded. These small decisions signaled an important change. Virginia was no longer only a place to observe or pass through. It was becoming a place where people imagined remaining. The rivers played a central role in this transition. Wide, slow-moving waterways offered access deep into the land, guiding movement naturally. Boats followed these routes with increasing confidence, learning their bends, currents, and seasonal changes. Riverbanks became points of repeated interaction, places where exchange, observation, and familiarity grew side by side. For indigenous communities, this growing presence was noted carefully. Elders watched patterns form where once there had been absence. Outsiders returned not only in warmer months, but sometimes attempted to stay through colder seasons. This persistence marked a shift. It suggested that visitors were no longer satisfied with brief contact alone. Life within indigenous societies continued with calm attentiveness. Seasonal planting, hunting, and gathering remained central. Knowledge passed steadily through generations, yet alongside routine, awareness deepened. Outsiders asked more questions. They observed more closely. They showed interest not only in trade, but in land itself. Misunderstandings became more frequent as intentions diverged. Where indigenous communities understood land as shared and relational, Europeans increasingly viewed it as something to claim and define. These differences were not always spoken. They existed quietly beneath interactions, shaping expectations without resolution. Efforts to establish early settlements were cautious and often uncertain. Structures were built modestly, using available materials. These early buildings did not dominate the landscape. They sat lightly upon it, vulnerable to weather, insects, and time. Many did not last long, reminding settlers that permanence in Virginia required adaptation rather than force. Food quickly became a central concern. Without deep understanding of local conditions, European visitors struggled to sustain themselves. Crops failed when planted without regard for climate or soil. Supplies from across the ocean were unreliable. Hunger became a quiet but persistent presence, shaping decisions and behavior. Indigenous knowledge proved essential. Guidance on planting, fishing, and seasonal survival often determined whether settlements endured or failed. These exchanges were sometimes cooperative, sometimes strained. Dependence existed, even when not acknowledged openly. The environment continued to assert its authority. Summers brought heat and illness. Winters tested preparation. Storms reshaped coastlines and flooded low ground. Forests resisted clearing. These challenges slowed expansion, forcing settlers to adjust rather than advance quickly. Communication between cultures remained limited. Language barriers persisted. Meaning was carried through repetition and shared experience rather than dialogue. Trust developed unevenly, often disrupted by fear or misunderstanding. Still, daily interaction continued, shaped by necessity. As settlements persisted, social structures began to form, roles emerged, responsibilities were divided. These systems were fragile, often disrupted by shortage or conflict. Yet they represented an important step toward permanence, a move from survival alone toward organization. Indigenous communities faced increasing pressure as settlement attempts expanded, hunting grounds shifted, travel routes became more crowded. While change remained gradual, its direction became clearer. The land was being asked to hold more people, more activity, more permanence than before. Despite these pressures, Virginia did not transform quickly. Many settlement efforts failed. Others survived only briefly. The land filtered ambition through difficulty, allowing only what could adapt to endure. This slow response preserved balance longer than intention alone would have allowed. As you imagine this phase, picture small clusters of buildings near rivers, smoke rising uncertainly, forests pressing close, indigenous communities nearby, continuing life with steady patience, the land vast, watchful, unchanged at its core. This was the turning point, not yet colonization, but no longer mere contact. A moment where curiosity leaned toward claim, where presence sought to become permanence. Virginia remained resilient, shaped more by environment than by ambition. And as time continued its steady movement forward, this land carried both worlds side by side, one rooted in ancient balance, the other learning, slowly and imperfectly, how difficult it was to remain number 4, permanent English settlement, and the birth of colonial Virginia. As time moved forward, the idea of permanence in Virginia slowly crossed from intention into action. What had once been uncertainty began to take on shape through repeated effort. Ships no longer arrived only to observe or explore. They arrived carrying people who expected to stay. Supplies were brought not just for travel, but for living. The land, vast and patient, watched as this new phase unfolded without haste. The earliest permanent settlements were fragile by design, whether their builders realized it or not. They rested at the edge of rivers and forests, exposed to weather, unfamiliar soil, and long seasons of isolation. These places were not cities, nor even towns. They were clusters of hope, balanced precariously against reality. Life within these early settlements was slow, demanding, and uncertain. Days were shaped by labor rather than comfort. Clearing land required effort far greater than anticipated. Forests resisted removal. Roots ran deep. Soil behaved differently than expected. Each task revealed how little the settlers truly understood about the environment they had entered. Food remained a constant concern. Crops planted according to distant knowledge often failed. Seasons did not align with expectation. Hunger arrived quietly, lingering longer than anticipated. Survival depended increasingly on adaptation rather than planning. Indigenous knowledge continued to shape outcomes, whether acknowledged openly or not. Techniques for planting, fishing, and storing food made the difference between endurance and collapse. Yet reliance created tension. Dependency challenged assumptions of control. Cooperation existed alongside mistrust, shaping relationships that were complex and fragile. Disease moved through settlements with little resistance. Bodies unaccustomed to the environment struggled. Illness spread quickly in confined spaces. Recovery was uncertain. Death became a frequent presence, not dramatic but persistent. This reality slowed ambition and reshaped expectation. Despite hardship, the settlements remained. Their endurance was not heroic but stubborn. People stayed because retreat felt like failure. Each season survived reinforced commitment. Structures were repaired. Defenses were adjusted. Routines formed slowly, shaped by trial rather than design. The land continued to assert its influence. Rivers flooded. Summers brought heat and insects. Winters tested preparation. These forces did not negotiate. They required response. Over time, settlers learned when to plant, where to build, and how to store resources more effectively. Learning was costly, but it was constant. Social order emerged unevenly. Leadership shifted with circumstance. Authority was often challenged by necessity. Decisions were made not through vision, but through urgency. Yet slowly patterns formed. Labor divided. Responsibilities clarified. Community identity began to take shape. Indigenous communities observed these changes carefully. Settlement altered movement, access, and balance. Hunting grounds narrowed. Paths intersected more frequently. While change remained gradual, its direction was unmistakable. The land was being asked to support permanence where fluidity had once prevailed. Trade expanded alongside tension. Goods moved more regularly. Exchange became expectation rather than novelty. These interactions layered complexity onto relationships that had once been brief and distant. Understanding did not always follow familiarity. The idea of ownership entered the land quietly but decisively. Boundaries were imagined before they were enforced. Land was measured, named, and claimed in ways that conflicted with indigenous understanding. These differences existed beneath the surface, shaping future conflict even when peace appeared to hold. Despite these shifts, Virginia did not transform quickly. Growth remained uneven. Many settlers left, others arrived. Survival continued to filter who remained. The land selected endurance over ambition. As you imagine this phase, picture a small settlement resting against a wide river. Wooden structures weathered by sun and rain, forest pressing close, smoke rising slowly, life unfolding without certainty. This was the beginning of colonial Virginia, not as an idea, but as a reality shaped by hardship, adaptation, and persistence. Not yet stable, not yet confident, but present. And as time continued its steady movement, these early settlements held on quietly, learning slowly and imperfectly what it meant to remain. As the early settlements in Virginia endured beyond their most fragile beginnings, a gradual shift began to take place. Survival was no longer the only concern. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the idea of growth entered daily life. This growth did not arrive as confidence or ease. It arrived as repetition. Seasons passed, routines formed, and familiarity replaced constant uncertainty. The land surrounding the settlements began to change in small ways. Forests were cleared selectively, not in sweeping transformation, but in careful patches close to dwellings. Fields expanded outward from rivers and paths shaped by trial and error. Soil revealed its character slowly, teaching settlers where crops could thrive and where effort would be wasted. Agriculture became more reliable over time, though never effortless. Certain crops adapted better than others, and experimentation guided decision-making. Success was measured not in abundance, but in consistency. Food storage improved. Seasonal planning became more precise. Hunger did not disappear, but it no longer defined every moment. With increased stability came population growth. New arrivals joined existing settlements, bringing fresh energy, expectations, and tension. Space became more contested. Resources required clearer management. The need for order grew naturally out of proximity rather than ambition. Social structures solidified gradually. Roles became more defined. Some focused on farming, others on trade, construction, or administration. Leadership became more stable, though still influenced by circumstance. Authority emerged not through vision alone, but through the ability to manage scarcity and resolve dispute. Trade expanded beyond immediate survival. Goods moved along rivers more regularly. Connections between settlements strengthened. Tobacco and other valuable crops began to shape economic focus, introducing new incentives and pressures. The land was no longer only a place to live. It became a source of profit. This economic shift altered relationships with the land itself. Fields were worked more intensively. Expansion reached farther from rivers. The pace of clearing increased. What had once been cautious adaptation began to lean toward extraction. The land responded slowly, absorbing change while signaling limits through erosion, depletion, and difficulty. Indigenous communities felt these changes more acutely as settlement expanded. Movement became constrained. Access to hunting and fishing areas narrowed. Encounters increased in frequency and complexity. Where cooperation had once dominated, tension now shared space. Communication between cultures grew more strained as expectations diverged. Europeans increasingly viewed land through the lens of ownership and permanence. Indigenous communities continued to understand it through relationship and shared use. These worldviews did not align, and resolution was elusive. Despite tension, daily interaction continued. Trade persisted, knowledge exchanged unevenly. Dependency remained mutual, even as trust weakened. The land itself remained a constant presence, shaping outcomes more decisively than intention. Conflict did not always arrive loudly. It appeared in small disruptions, misunderstood boundaries, competing claims, broken agreements. These moments accumulated slowly, altering relationships without immediate collapse. Virginia existed in a state of uneasy balance. As settlements grew, defenses were strengthened. Structures became sturdier. Planning extended further into the future. Permanence was no longer questioned. It was assumed. This assumption marked a turning point. The land was now expected to yield stability rather than demand adaptation alone. The environment continued to assert its influence. Floods reminded settlers of river power. Drought tested agriculture. Disease still moved through communities, though improved understanding reduced its reach. Each challenge reinforced humility, even as confidence grew. Time moved steadily forward. Years blended together. Generations began to be born on Virginian soil rather than arriving from afar. Identity slowly shifted. This was no longer only a distant outpost. It was becoming home for some, even as it displaced others. As you imagine this phase, picture expanding fields under open sky. Riverboats moving calmly, settlements growing outward in measured steps. Indigenous communities watching, adapting, enduring. This was colonial Virginia in transition, no longer fragile, not yet secure, shaped by growth that arrived quietly, carrying both opportunity and strain. And as time continued its calm progression, the land held these changes patiently, preparing, without warning or urgency, for the deeper conflicts and transformations that would eventually follow as colonial Virginia continued to expand and settle into its growing sense of permanence. The land entered a period where change became quieter but deeper. The earliest chaos of survival had passed. In its place came routine, expectation, and a belief that the future could be shaped deliberately. This belief did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with habit. Fields were planted each year without question. Homes were repaired rather than abandoned. Life continued forward with an assumption of tomorrow. Settlements grew outward slowly, not in dramatic leaps, but in measured steps. Forest edges retreated as farmland expanded. Paths became roads through repetition. Riverbanks carried more traffic, their waters reflecting boats that moved with purpose rather than exploration. The landscape was still vast, but human presence became more consistent, more confident. Economic life settled into recognizable patterns. Agriculture dominated daily labor, tying survival and prosperity to land productivity. Certain crops shaped not only fields but social structure. Work cycles aligned with planting and harvest. Time itself began to feel organized around output rather than season alone. With stability came inequality. Access to land, labor, and resources varied widely. Some accumulated wealth and influence. Others remained dependent, working land they did not own. These differences did not explode into conflict immediately. They settled quietly into daily life, shaping opportunity and expectation over time. Governance became more formal as population increased. Rules were written, enforced unevenly at first, then with greater consistency. Courts, councils, and offices appeared not as symbols of power, but as tools to manage complexity. Authority solidified through repetition rather than declaration. Indigenous communities faced increasing displacement as expansion continued. Lands once shared became restricted. Access to rivers, forests, and fields narrowed. Traditional movement patterns were interrupted. These changes unfolded gradually, often without direct confrontation, yet their impact was profound. Resistance existed, though it often took quiet forms. Movement shifted, alliances strengthened, adaptation continued. Indigenous knowledge, refined over centuries, did not vanish. It adjusted, endured, and persisted even under pressure. Cultural distance widened. Where cooperation had once defined interaction, separation grew. Trust eroded through misunderstanding and unmet expectation. The land itself became a point of conflict, not because it changed, but because meanings imposed upon it did. Despite tension, daily life continued. Crops were planted, children were born, seasons passed. The rhythm of ordinary existence softened the presence of deeper change, allowing transformation to occur without constant awareness. Religion and belief systems shaped moral order within settlements, reinforcing structure and discipline. These systems provided comfort and explanation, offering certainty in an environment that still held unpredictability. Faith helped define identity as much as geography. Disease patterns shifted as settlements stabilized. While illness remained present, familiarity bred knowledge. Response improved, survival rates increased, life expectancy extended slightly. These changes reinforced the sense that permanence was achievable. The land continued to respond to use. Soil showed signs of exhaustion where worked heavily. Forests retreated unevenly. Wildlife patterns shifted. These signals were subtle, often ignored, but they marked the beginning of long-term environmental consequence. Virginia now existed as a colonial society rather than an experiment. Its identity formed quietly, layered from habit, adaptation, and compromise. The past did not disappear. It lingered beneath the surface, shaping the future in unseen ways. As you imagine this stage, picture wide fields under soft evening light, settlements resting quietly along rivers, forests standing just beyond cleared land, life moving forward without urgency yet without return. This was the close of Virginia's earliest colonial formation, not an ending but a settling. The land remained patient, time remained steady, and beneath the calm surface forces gathered slowly, preparing the ground for struggles and transformations still to come. Number 5. Colonial Virginia and the growth of plantation society. As Virginia moved beyond its earliest colonial formation, the land entered a period where routine replaced uncertainty and familiarity softened the memory of hardship. The settlements no longer felt temporary, even if life remained demanding. Generations had now lived and died on Virginian soil. Memory was no longer imported from across the ocean. It was being formed locally, shaped by rivers, fields, forests, and seasons. Daily life settled into a steady rhythm. Mornings began with labor guided by light rather than clock. Fields were tended methodically. Animals were cared for. Repairs were constant. not because things failed suddenly, but because use wore them down slowly. Life was no longer about endurance alone. It was about maintenance, holding together what had already been built. The land became deeply tied to identity. Families associated themselves with specific plots, rivers, and paths. Ownership, once abstract, became personal. Boundaries mattered more now. They were marked, remembered, and defended not through force alone, but through habit and law. The idea of inheritance grew alongside permanence, shaping how the future was imagined. Economic life expanded quietly but decisively. Agriculture remained central, but it became more specialized. Certain crops dominated labor and attention, shaping not only fields but social structure. Wealth accumulated unevenly, creating visible differences in comfort and influence. These differences did not erupt suddenly. They settled gradually into daily life, shaping opportunity over time. Labor systems grew more complex. Some worked land they owned, others worked land owned by someone else. Dependency became structured rather than temporary. This shift altered relationships between people, embedding hierarchy into routine. Inequality did not announce itself. It normalized itself through repetition. As communities grew, towns developed slowly around centers of trade and administration. These were not large cities, but recognizable hubs where goods, information, and authority converged. Roads improved through use rather than design. Rivers remained the most reliable pathways, carrying movement and connection quietly across the land. Governance became more present in everyday life. Laws were enforced with increasing consistency. Courts handled disputes that once would have been settled informally. Authority felt closer now, shaping behavior subtly through expectation rather than threat. Order replaced improvisation. Indigenous communities continued to experience increasing pressure. Expansion narrowed access to land and resources. Treaties, when made, were often misunderstood or unevenly honored. Displacement occurred gradually, filtered through policy and settlement rather than immediate conflict. Loss unfolded quietly, compounding over time. Despite these pressures, Indigenous presence did not vanish. Knowledge persisted. Communities adapted, relocated, and endured. Cultural memory remained strong, even as physical space shrank. Resistance existed not always through confrontation, but through survival itself. Religious and cultural life within colonial Virginia deepened, shaping moral structure and social expectation. Belief offered comfort and justification, reinforcing norms and hierarchy. Community gatherings followed predictable patterns, anchoring identity in shared practice. Education, where available, reinforced continuity. Children learn not only skills, but assumptions about land, labor, and belonging. These lessons shape the future more powerfully than any single law or decision. The environment continued to respond quietly to use. Soil productivity shifted, forest edges moved farther away, wildlife patterns changed subtly. These effects were often noticed only when absence replaced abundance. The land did not protest. It adjusted. Virginia now existed as a mature colony, no longer defined by survival alone. Its identity was layered, shaped by labor, belief, inequality, and adaptation. The past remained present beneath routine, influencing decisions even when unspoken. As you imagine this phase, picture wide farmland under soft afternoon light, rivers carrying slow traffic, small towns resting between forest and field, life moving steadily without urgency, yet without stillness. This was colonial Virginia entering maturity, settled, structured, and confident in its direction, even as deeper tensions gathered quietly beneath the surface. And as time continued its calm progression, this land carried forward its routines, preparing, without pause, for the larger conflicts and transformations that history would eventually bring. As Virginia continued to move deeper into its colonial maturity, the quiet confidence that had settled over daily life began to carry subtle tension beneath its calm surface. Routine still guided the days, and the land continued to provide a sense of order. Yet change was slowly gathering, not loudly, not suddenly, but patiently, as it always had. Plantations expanded gradually, their boundaries stretching outward season by season. What had once been modest holdings grew into large estates, reshaping both landscape and society. Fields replaced forests. Paths became roads through repeated use. Rivers carried heavier loads of goods, connecting inland production to distant markets beyond the horizon. This expansion reshaped labor more deeply than before. Systems that had once been flexible became fixed. Human lives were increasingly bound to land ownership and production. Labor was no longer simply work, it was structure. It defined status, movement, and opportunity. These systems embedded themselves into everyday life so completely that they began to feel natural, unquestioned. Wealth concentrated quietly. Some households accumulated resources steadily, building comfort and influence over generations. Others remained tied to survival-level labor, their days shaped by necessity rather than choice. This division did not erupt into chaos. It settled into routine, reinforced by custom, law, and expectation. Social life followed predictable patterns. Gatherings reflected hierarchy. Language reflected position. Even silence carried meaning, shaped by awareness of place within the community. These signals were rarely spoken aloud, yet they were deeply understood. Governance became more formal and more present. Local assemblies met regularly. Decisions were recorded, debated, and enforced. Authority no longer felt distant or symbolic. It shaped daily reality. Taxes were collected, property disputes were resolved. Order was maintained not through constant force, but through accepted structure. Virginia's economy became increasingly tied to distant systems. Ships arrived and departed regularly, carrying goods, news, and influence. The colony no longer existed in isolation. Events far away now affected prices, availability, and stability at home. This connection expanded opportunity while introducing vulnerability. Despite this growing complexity, life retained a slow pace. Communication remained limited by distance. Travel took time. Information arrived gradually. This delay softened shock and allowed adjustment. Change, even when significant, arrived gently enough to be absorbed. Indigenous displacement continued quietly, often unnoticed by those benefiting from expansion. Boundaries shifted, access narrowed. Communities were pushed farther from ancestral land. This loss unfolded over years rather than moments, making it easier to ignore, yet no less profound. Cultural identity deepened alongside division. Virginia began to see itself not merely as a settlement, but as a society with shared values and assumptions. These assumptions shaped education, belief, and ambition. Children grew up expecting continuity, rarely imagining alternatives. Religious life reinforced stability. Faith offered explanation and comfort, helping people accept both fortune and hardship. It shaped morality, justified hierarchy, and provided rhythm to time through shared observance. Religion did not disrupt life, it organized it. The land itself continued to respond silently. Soil grew tired in places, requiring expansion into new areas. Forests retreated further. Wildlife patterns shifted. These changes were rarely framed as warning. They were treated as challenges to be managed, not consequences to be questioned. Virginia now stood firmly rooted, productive, organized, and confident. Yet beneath this calm surface, the systems holding everything together were growing more rigid. Flexibility narrowed, differences hardened. What had once been adaptation began to feel like permanence. As you imagine this stage, picture long rows of cultivated fields stretching toward distant trees. Slow-moving rivers reflecting the sky. Homes standing quietly under evening light. Life continuing steadily, measured and predictable. This was Virginia deep in its colonial rhythm, prosperous for some, constrained for others, stable on the surface, yet quietly preparing for pressures that routine alone could no longer contain. And as time moved forward without haste, the land held these patterns gently, unaware that the calm it carried was slowly giving way to questions that would one day rise beyond whispers. As Virginia moved further along its colonial path, the sense of permanence that had slowly settled over the land began to feel both comforting and confining. Life followed familiar rhythms. Fields were planted and harvested. Goods moved steadily along rivers and roads. Laws were enforced. Traditions were repeated. On the surface, everything appeared balanced and predictable. Yet beneath this steady routine, quiet pressures continued to build. Generations were now growing up who had never known Virginia as a fragile settlement. For them, this land was home, not an experiment. They inherited estates, occupations, beliefs, and expectations. Their world felt established, ordered, and reliable. But with inheritance came obligation to maintain systems that no longer felt flexible and to accept structures that left little room for change. Economic dependency deepened. Virginia's prosperity relied heavily on a narrow range of exports, tying its future to distant markets it could not control. Prices rose and fell beyond local influence. Decisions made across the ocean shaped livelihoods at home. This dependence was quiet but powerful, threading uncertainty into everyday life. Social divisions hardened further. Class lines became more clearly defined, reinforced by law, education, and custom. Movement between these layers grew increasingly rare. A person's place in society was often determined at birth, not by ability or effort. This rigidity brought stability, but it also planted frustration, especially among those who labored without reward or recognition. Enslaved people carried the heaviest burden of this system. Their lives were structured entirely around the needs of others, their time and movement controlled, their voices suppressed. Their presence underpinned the colony's wealth, yet their humanity was denied by law and practice. This injustice was woven so deeply into daily life that many ceased to question it, even as it quietly shaped every aspect of society. Resistance existed, but it was muted. It took the form of endurance, subtle defiance, cultural memory, and quiet solidarity. These acts rarely disrupted the surface calm, yet they preserved identity and dignity beneath oppression. History would remember these moments not as loud rebellion, but as persistence. Governance continued to grow more complex. Local leaders balanced loyalty to distant authority with the practical needs of the colony. Decisions were debated, compromises made, and tensions managed through discussion rather than confrontation. For now, order held. Religious and cultural traditions continued to provide meaning and structure. They offered explanations for inequality, comfort in hardship, and reassurance in uncertainty. Faith shaped how people understood their place in the world, reinforcing patience and acceptance. The land itself bore the marks of long use. Forests thinned. Soil required rest or replacement. Expansion pushed settlements outward, further displacing indigenous communities who had already lost so much. These changes happened gradually enough to avoid alarm, yet they altered the landscape permanently. Virginia, by this point, was no longer simply growing, it was consolidating. Its systems were set, its identity felt fixed. The colony believed it understood itself and its future. But history rarely remains still. As the years passed, new ideas began to travel quietly alongside goods and news. Concepts of rights, representation, and self-determination moved slowly through conversations and letters. They did not immediately disrupt daily life, but they lingered, waiting. For now, Virginia remained calm, productive, and orderly. The routines of planting, harvesting, governing, and worship continued. Children learned the same lessons their parents had learned. Seasons passed as they always had. As you imagine this moment, picture a warm evening settling over wide fields, lanterns glowing softly near homes, rivers flowing steadily in the distance. Life unfolding predictably, peacefully. This was Virginia at the height of its colonial confidence, stable, structured, and deeply rooted, yet unknowingly standing at the edge of transformation. And as time continued its gentle movement forward, the land held these patterns quietly, unaware that the calm it carried was preparing the ground for questions that would soon grow too large to remain unanswered. Number 6. Virginia and the American Revolution. As Virginia moved closer to the middle of the 18th century, a quiet shift began to take place beneath the steady routines of colonial life. Nothing dramatic announced this change. Fields were still planted, rivers still carried goods. Markets still opened and closed with familiar regularity. Yet beneath this surface calm, the way people thought about authority, belonging, and future possibility was slowly, almost imperceptibly, changing. For generations, life in Virginia had been shaped by distance. Decisions came from far away. Kings, parliaments, and policies existed across an ocean, removed from daily experience. This distance had once made authority feel abstract and distant, something acknowledged but rarely felt. Over time, however, Virginia had grown more self-sufficient. Local governance handled daily matters. Communities relied on their own labor, resources, and judgment. The colony had learned how to function largely on its own. This growing confidence did not immediately turn into resistance. Instead, it settled quietly into identity. People began to see themselves not only as subjects of a distant power, but as members of a place with its own needs, customs, and expectations. Virginia was no longer just an extension of elsewhere. It was a society shaped by land, labor, and shared experience. Economic pressure played a subtle role in this shift. Trade regulations increasingly affected daily life. Restrictions shaped what could be sold, where it could be shipped, and at what price. These rules were designed far away, often without full understanding of local realities. At first, such limitations were tolerated as part of the existing order. Over time, however, they began to feel restrictive rather than protective. Merchants noticed shrinking margins. Farmers felt the strain of fluctuating prices. Small producers struggled to compete within systems they did not control. These frustrations were rarely voiced loudly. Instead, they accumulated quietly, discussed in private conversations, letters, and long evenings by the fire. Education and literacy expanded slowly during this period. More people learned to read and write, gaining access to ideas that traveled across the Atlantic along with goods. Pamphlets, letters, and newspapers introduced new ways of thinking about governance, rights, and representation. These ideas did not immediately inspire action. They settled gently into thought, waiting. Religious life also contributed to changing perspectives. Faith had long provided structure and explanation, but it also encouraged reflection and moral questioning. Sermons emphasized personal conscience and responsibility. Over time, this focus nurtured a belief that authority should be just, accountable, and responsive. Virginia's social hierarchy remained intact, but its legitimacy was increasingly examined rather than assumed. Landowners continued to hold influence. Laws still favored established power, yet conversations began to explore whether loyalty was absolute or conditional, whether obedience was owed simply by tradition or earned through fairness. Enslaved people remained excluded from these discussions, their lives constrained by a system that denied them voice and freedom. Yet even within oppression, awareness grew. Cultural memory, shared endurance, and quiet resistance preserved identity and humanity beneath enforced silence. These undercurrents, though often unseen, were part of the colony's evolving story. Indigenous displacement continued largely unchallenged, pushed further from attention as colonial concerns turned inward. Expansion pressed outward, reshaping land ownership and access. These losses unfolded quietly, absorbed into the assumption of progress without reflection. Governance became more active in everyday affairs. Taxes, regulations, and oversight increased, often to support conflicts and interests beyond Virginia's borders. These demands began to feel personal rather than distant. Authority, once abstract, now reached into households and livelihoods. Despite these pressures, life remained outwardly calm. Seasons passed, social events continued, the rhythm of work and rest endured. Virginia did not yet imagine rupture. It believed itself stable, capable, and resilient. As you imagine this moment, picture long roads stretching between towns, printed pages folded into pockets, quiet conversations held behind closed doors. A society still calm, yet beginning to listen more closely to itself. This was Virginia standing at the threshold of awareness, not yet in conflict, not yet in motion, but slowly, steadily beginning to question. And as time continued its gentle flow, these questions settled deeper, preparing the ground for changes that would soon rise beyond thought into action. The years continued to move forward quietly, and with each passing season, life in Virginia appeared calm on the surface, while slowly changing beneath it. Fields were planted and harvested as they always had been. Rivers carried boats steadily toward the coast. Towns remained modest, their routines familiar. Yet inside homes, meeting houses, and quiet gathering places, thoughts were shifting. People were listening more closely, thinking more deeply, and weighing ideas that once felt distant but now felt personal. Virginia had grown accustomed to managing its own affairs in practical ways. Local decisions shaped daily life far more than distant commands ever could. This experience created confidence, though it was rarely spoken aloud. People did not describe themselves as defiant. They saw themselves as reasonable, careful, and invested in stability. They believed order mattered, but they also believed fairness mattered just as much. Economic pressure continued to rest gently but persistently on daily life. Tobacco still moved across oceans, tying Virginia to distant markets and decisions beyond its control. When prices fell or costs rose, the impact was felt slowly but deeply. Debt accumulated quietly, often carried from one season to the next. These burdens did not cause sudden anger, but they encouraged reflection. Many began to question whether a system so distant could truly understand local realities. New laws and regulations arrived from afar with increasing frequency. Each one seemed small on its own, but together they formed a pattern that felt unsettling. Paper required stamps, trade routes narrowed. Decisions were enforced by officials who often felt unfamiliar and disconnected. None of this arrived with violence, yet the weight of it was unmistakable. Political awareness spread without urgency. Conversations unfolded slowly, often framed in respectful language. People did not rush to conclusions. They compared present conditions with past expectations. They remembered promises made and wondered why those promises now felt less certain. The idea that authority should involve consent began to take shape naturally, not as rebellion, but as common sense. Public discussion remained calm. Letters were written carefully. Meetings were conducted with patience. Words were chosen deliberately, avoiding extremes. Many still hoped that misunderstandings could be resolved. There was a strong desire to preserve peace, to maintain continuity, to avoid unnecessary disruption. Virginia valued order deeply, and that value guided its restraint. At the same time, contradictions became harder to ignore. The language of rights and liberties circulated more widely, even as large parts of the population remained excluded from those ideas. Enslaved people continued to labor under harsh conditions, their lives shaped by systems that denied them voice or recognition. Indigenous communities were pushed farther from lands they had known for generations, their presence increasingly overlooked. These realities existed alongside discussions of freedom, creating a quiet tension that few could fully reconcile. Still, daily life continued. Children learned trades. Families gathered in the evenings. Church bells marked time gently. The landscape itself seemed unchanged, rolling calmly beneath wide skies. This contrast between routine and reflection gave the period its unique character. Nothing felt urgent, yet nothing felt settled. Fear did not dominate this time, but neither did certainty. There was fear of instability, of conflict, of loss. There was also hope that reason might prevail, that balance could be restored, that Virginia could remain both loyal and self-respecting. These emotions existed together, shaping decisions quietly rather than dramatically. As months turned into years, patience was tested. Appeals went unanswered or returned with conditions that felt dismissive. Trust eroded not through shock, but through repetition. Each delay, each dismissal, added to a growing sense that voices from Virginia were not truly being heard. Yet even then, Virginia did not rush forward. It paused, it considered. It remembered its own history of self-governance and cooperation. The colony had learned how to survive hardship through adaptation rather than force. That lesson still guided its actions. By this point, change had already occurred internally. The people of Virginia had begun to see themselves differently, not as passive recipients of rule, but as participants in shaping society. This shift did not announce itself. It settled gently into thought, altering perspective more than behavior. As you imagine this moment, picture quiet roads at dusk, papers folded carefully on wooden tables, conversations ending not with anger, but with thoughtful silence. A society standing calmly at a threshold, not rushing forward, yet no longer willing to turn back. Virginia had not yet chosen its path openly, but it had already learned that choice was possible. And as time continued its slow, even movement, this understanding rested quietly in the background of daily life, waiting patiently for the moment when reflection would give way to action, when careful thought would finally require a response. The tension that had been building quietly across Virginia did not suddenly break into noise. It continued to deepen in silence, settling into everyday life so completely that it became part of the background. People woke, worked, and rested as they always had, yet the way they understood their place in the world was no longer the same. Thought had shifted, perspective had widened, and once that change occurred, it could not be undone. Virginia's connection to distant authority now felt more fragile than firm. Orders still arrived. Officials still spoke in the language of control and loyalty, but their words carried less certainty than before. They sounded formal, practiced, and increasingly disconnected from lived experience. For many, these commands felt like echoes from another world, one that did not fully understand the land, the people, or the rhythms of life shaped by Virginia's soil. The sense of shared identity within the colony strengthened quietly. People who once saw themselves primarily as individuals or families now felt part of something larger. This did not emerge as nationalism or pride in a modern sense. It emerged as familiarity, familiar struggles, familiar concerns, familiar hopes. The idea that neighbors shared not just space but destiny grew naturally. Community discussions became more reflective than reactive. People spoke less about what they opposed and more about what they believed was right. Fairness, balance, responsibility, and mutual respect became central themes. These were not abstract ideals. They were principles drawn from daily life. How crops were shared, how disputes were resolved, how promises were kept. Trust in distant solutions faded slowly. Each unanswered concern, each rigid policy, each delay reinforced the belief that understanding would not arrive from afar. This realization did not produce immediate anger. Instead, it produced resolve. A quiet willingness to take responsibility for local outcomes began to form. For enslaved people, this period carried a different kind of tension. The language of liberty drifted through the air, spoken openly yet rarely directed toward them. Some listened closely, recognizing the power of these words even as they were excluded. Others focused on survival, on preserving family, memory, and identity under systems designed to erase them. Resistance was often silent, acts of endurance rather than defiance, but it was constant. Indigenous communities continued to face displacement and marginalization, their voices increasingly absent from formal discussion. The expansion of settlement pressed forward steadily, reshaping landscapes and relationships. These changes were rarely debated openly. They occurred through routine, policy, and assumption, leaving lasting marks that were often unacknowledged. Despite these deep contradictions, Virginia's path forward remained cautious. The colony did not seek chaos. It sought stability rooted in fairness rather than control. This desire restrained action even as conviction grew. Many still hoped that reconciliation was possible, that distant authority might recognize the depth of local understanding and adjust accordingly. Yet time continued to pass, and patience thinned gently but unmistakably. The space between what was hoped for and what was experienced widened. This gap did not close through argument or negotiation. It remained, shaping perception quietly. What made this moment significant was not what happened outwardly, but what settled inwardly. Virginia had learned to trust its own judgment. Experience had become a guide stronger than instruction. Memory of self-governance, cooperation, and adaptation reinforced the belief that local wisdom mattered. Daily routines continued to soften the weight of uncertainty. Fields were tended, goods were exchanged, children grew and learned. Life did not pause for political thought. Instead, political thought lived within life, shaped by it rather than separate from it. As seasons passed, it became clear that Virginia was no longer simply reacting to change. It was preparing, mentally, emotionally, and socially, for a future that would require decision. Not rash decision, not violent decision, but deliberate choice. The land itself seemed unchanged, rolling quietly beneath wide skies, offering no sign of what was to come. Yet those who lived upon it carried a growing awareness that history does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly, through thought, through conversation, through the slow alignment of belief and experience. As you imagine this moment, picture an evening settling over the countryside, the air still, the light fading gently, homes filled with quiet reflection, a society resting but not asleep, calm but alert. Virginia had not yet stepped forward, but it had finished standing still. And as time continued its steady, patient flow, this readiness remained, quiet, grounded, and enduring, waiting for the moment when reflection would naturally become action, and when the calm accumulation of thought would finally shape the next chapter of its long and unfolding story.
Number 7. Expansion, slavery, and social change in the 19th century.
As the 19th century began, Virginia entered a period of steady expansion that felt on the surface calm and familiar. The land stretched wide, fields continued to be cultivated, and communities followed rhythms that had shaped life for generations. Yet beneath this sense of continuity, powerful changes were unfolding, changes that would quietly reshape society, relationships, and identity in ways that could not be easily reversed. Expansion in Virginia was not sudden. It moved slowly, guided by land, labor, and inheritance. Farms grew larger, settlements pushed outward, forests were cleared carefully, season by season, turning wilderness into ordered space. Roads extended farther into rural areas, connecting communities that had once felt distant. This growth felt natural to many, as though the land itself were inviting use and settlement. But expansion carried weight. Every acre brought questions of labor ownership and control. As plantations expanded, the demand for enslaved labor increased. Slavery became more deeply embedded in daily life, not only as an economic system but as a social structure that shaped identity, power, and opportunity. For those who benefited from expansion, life appeared stable and productive. Wealth accumulated quietly. Social hierarchies hardened. Families measured success in land, crops, and legacy. The system felt permanent, reinforced by law, custom, and routine. Many accepted it without question, seeing it as part of the natural order of life. For enslaved people, expansion meant increased hardship. As plantations grew, families were separated more frequently, labor intensified, surveillance increased, daily life was shaped by control rather than choice. Yet within this harsh reality, enslaved communities preserved culture, memory, and resistance in quiet ways, through song, story, faith, and mutual care. These acts rarely appeared in records, but they sustained identity and dignity. Social change did not arrive dramatically. It unfolded unevenly, shaped by geography and experience. In some areas, traditional ways of life persisted almost unchanged. In others, economic shifts altered relationships between landowners, small farmers, and laborers. Markets expanded, transportation improved, ideas moved more freely than before. The institution of slavery, once rarely questioned publicly, began to sit uneasily within these changes. Debates emerged quietly at first, often framed as economic or moral concerns rather than direct challenges. Some worried about dependence on a single labor system. Others spoke cautiously about human cost. These conversations did not dominate public life, but they existed, growing slowly beneath the surface. Free black communities, though limited in rights and opportunity, formed spaces of resilience and mutual support. Their presence complicated rigid social definitions, reminding society that identity and humanity could not be fully controlled by law. These communities faced constant pressure, yet they endured through cooperation and quiet determination. Women's roles also shifted subtly during this century. While legal authority remained limited, women influenced households, education, and moral life. Through teaching, caregiving, and community involvement, they shaped values passed to future generations. Their labor, often unseen, held families and communities together during times of uncertainty. Religion played a powerful role in shaping social change. Churches expanded, offering spaces for reflection, instruction, and shared experience. Faith provided comfort and meaning, but it also reinforced existing structures. Some sermons emphasized obedience and order, while others spoke of compassion and moral responsibility. These differing messages reflected broader tensions within society. As the century progressed, Virginia found itself balancing tradition and transformation. The land continued to produce, society continued to function. Yet the contradictions between expansion and equality, prosperity and suffering, stability and injustice became harder to ignore. Political life reflected this tension. Laws protected property and hierarchy, even as ideals of liberty remained part of national identity. Compromise became a way of maintaining calm, delaying confrontation rather than resolving it. This delay preserved order in the short term, but it allowed deeper divisions to grow quietly. For Indigenous peoples, expansion meant continued displacement. Lands were taken gradually, often through policy rather than force, yet the result was the same: loss of place, memory, and autonomy. Their stories were increasingly absent from public discussion, though their presence remained part of the land's deeper history. Daily life in Virginia during this time remained outwardly steady. Seasons passed predictably. Work continued. Communities gathered for markets, worship, and family events. This normalcy made it easy to overlook the depth of change taking place beneath routine. As you imagine this period, picture wide fields under soft morning light. Labor unfolding quietly, conversations carried on porches and in kitchens, lives moving forward calmly, even as the foundation beneath them slowly shifted. The 19th century did not announce its transformation loudly, it whispered it. Expansion brought growth, but also imbalance. Slavery brought wealth for some, suffering for many. Social change arrived not through sudden rupture, but through steady pressure. And as time continued to move forward, Virginia carried these contradictions with it, layering prosperity over injustice, tradition over unrest, preparing, without fully realizing it, for conflicts and reckonings that could no longer be postponed, no matter how calm the surface of life appeared. The changes that had begun quietly in Virginia during the early 19th century continued to deepen as the years passed, settling more firmly into daily life. What once felt like gradual adjustment now felt like an established reality. Expansion had reshaped the land, and with it, the structure of society itself. Fields stretched farther than before, towns became more connected, and commerce moved with increasing regularity. Yet the deeper the system grew, the harder it became to ignore its weight. Slavery remained at the center of this expanding world. It was not only an economic foundation, but a presence woven into everyday routines, decisions, and assumptions. Enslaved labor supported agriculture, domestic life, and trade, allowing prosperity for some while denying humanity to others. This imbalance was sustained not through constant force alone, but through habit, law, and silence. For many, the system felt permanent simply because it had always been there. For enslaved people, daily life required endurance shaped by uncertainty. Families lived with the constant threat of separation. Movement was controlled. Choices were limited. Yet within these constraints, enslaved communities continued to create meaning and connection. Music, storytelling, faith, and shared memory became ways of preserving identity. Resistance often took quiet forms, slowing labor, preserving culture, seeking moments of autonomy. These acts rarely appeared in official histories, but they were central to survival. As Virginia's economy evolved, new pressures emerged. Soil exhaustion from long-term tobacco farming encouraged diversification and movement westward. Some landowners sold enslaved people to new regions, breaking families apart to maintain profitability. This internal trade intensified suffering while remaining largely invisible to those who benefited from it. Expansion no longer meant only growth, it meant displacement within displacement. At the same time, small farmers and laborers felt the strain of competition and inequality. Not everyone benefited equally from expansion. Wealth concentrated in certain hands, while others struggled to maintain independence. Debt, market fluctuations, and access to land shaped opportunity unevenly. Social divisions hardened quietly, reinforcing hierarchy through routine rather than declaration. Ideas continued to move alongside goods. Newspapers, sermons, and conversations carried discussions of morality, economy, and identity. Abolitionist thought, though often resisted, began to circulate more clearly. These ideas did not dominate public life in Virginia, but they existed, sometimes openly challenged, sometimes quietly considered. The presence of these discussions revealed a growing discomfort that could not be fully suppressed. Religion remained a powerful force in shaping perspective. Churches offered comfort and community, but they also reflected social divisions. Some congregations defended existing systems, framing them as ordained or unavoidable. Others emphasized compassion, accountability, and shared humanity. These differing interpretations coexisted, creating moral tension without immediate resolution. Women's influence continued to shape households and communities. Though excluded from formal political power, women carried responsibility for education, moral guidance, and family stability. Their roles adapted quietly as society changed, allowing them to influence future generations even within restricted boundaries. Their labor, like that of enslaved people, was often undervalued yet essential. Free black communities remained under constant pressure, navigating restrictive laws and social hostility. Their existence challenged rigid definitions of status and control. Through churches, schools, and mutual aid, they built spaces of resilience. Survival required caution, cooperation, and strength. Their presence added complexity to Virginia's social fabric, reminding society that identity could not be fully contained. Indigenous peoples continued to experience erasure through policy and settlement. Expansion reduced access to ancestral lands and disrupted long-standing ways of life. These losses were rarely acknowledged publicly, yet they shaped the landscape deeply. Roads, farms, and towns rose where memory had once lived, layering new stories over older ones without pause. Despite all this, life continued with a sense of normalcy. Markets opened, crops were harvested, children grew. Celebrations and mourning followed familiar patterns. This continuity softened the visibility of injustice, allowing society to function without confronting its deepest contradictions directly. As decades passed, the gap between ideals and reality widened. The language of liberty existed alongside systems of control. Prosperity existed alongside suffering. Stability existed alongside unrest. These contrasts did not explode into immediate conflict, but they accumulated quietly, pressing against the boundaries of patience and denial. As you imagine this phase of Virginia's history, picture long afternoons under open skies, work unfolding steadily, voices lowered, careful, lives shaped by routine, even as unseen forces gathered strength beneath the surface. The 19th century continued its slow movement forward, carrying Virginia with it. Expansion had reshaped the land. Slavery had reshaped society. Social change had begun its quiet work. not through sudden upheaval but through steady pressure. And as time flowed on, these unresolved tensions remained, waiting patiently for a moment when they could no longer be contained by habit or silence, when the calm surface of daily life would finally be forced to reflect the depth of change already taking place beneath it. As the 19th century moved toward its later decades, the forces shaping Virginia grew heavier and more complex. Expansion, slavery, and social change were no longer separate ideas moving alongside one another. They had become deeply entangled, forming a structure that defined daily life while quietly straining under its own weight. What had once felt stable now carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that could be sensed even in ordinary routines. Expansion continued, but it no longer felt open or hopeful in the way it once had. Land that had been abundant earlier in the century now carried the marks of long use. Farms were larger, but soil was thinner. Movement westward continued, yet it brought mixed results. Some families found opportunity while others experienced loss of land, of labor, of community. Expansion no longer promised renewal for everyone. Instead, it revealed limits. Slavery remained deeply embedded in this expanding world, but its contradictions were becoming harder to ignore. The system required constant reinforcement through law, social pressure, and violence, even when it appeared calm on the surface. Enslaved people were expected to sustain an economy while being denied participation in it. This imbalance demanded emotional distance from those who benefited, creating a culture of justification and silence. For enslaved individuals, endurance remained central to life, yet endurance did not mean passivity. Families continued to form bonds even under threat. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Faith offered grounding. Small acts of resistance, subtle refusals, preservation of identity, moments of self-direction, continued to assert humanity within an inhumane system. These actions rarely changed laws, but they sustained lives. The internal slave trade intensified during this period, reshaping Virginia profoundly. As agriculture shifted and profitability changed, enslaved people were sold and transported farther south and west. Communities were fractured, families were separated without warning. This movement drained Virginia of population while deepening trauma. It was expansion through removal, growth through loss. Free black communities faced increasing restrictions. Laws tightened. Movement became more controlled. Opportunities narrowed. Yet despite these pressures, community life persisted. Churches, schools, and networks of support continued quietly. Survival required constant awareness, but it also fostered resilience and mutual care. These communities stood as living evidence that identity and dignity could not be fully erased. White society, too, experienced tension. Economic inequality grew. Not all white Virginians benefited from slavery or expansion, yet many were bound to the system through fear of loss or social pressure. Class divisions deepened. Political debates grew sharper. Loyalty to tradition competed with frustration and uncertainty. Change was discussed more openly, though rarely resolved. Women's roles continued to evolve subtly. Within households, women managed labor, education, and emotional stability. Some began to engage more actively in reform movements, particularly those connected to religion and morality. Their influence remained informal, but it was significant. Through teaching, caregiving, and moral guidance, women shaped perspectives that would later influence broader change. Religion played an increasingly complex role. Some religious leaders defended slavery as necessary or divinely sanctioned. Others spoke of compassion, equality before God, and moral responsibility. Churches became spaces of both reinforcement and quiet challenge. The same scriptures were used to justify opposing views, reflecting the deep divisions within society. Indigenous presence, already marginalized, continued to fade from public awareness. Displacement and removal had pushed many communities beyond Virginia's visible landscape. Their absence was treated as final, even though memory and consequence remained embedded in the land itself. expansion often erased without acknowledgement. Despite these pressures, everyday life maintained its rhythm. Fields were worked, towns held gatherings, children were raised. This continuity masked instability, allowing society to function while unresolved contradictions accumulated beneath the surface. Normalcy became a kind of cover, softening awareness of crisis. As national conversations grew louder, Virginia found itself increasingly aware of its position within a changing country. Ideas of freedom, rights, and identity circulated more widely. Resistance to change hardened in some quarters, while doubt deepened in others. The state stood between past and future, pulled in both directions. As you imagine this final stage of the era, picture familiar landscapes carrying quiet tension, long roads stretching across worn fields, homes filled with routine and unspoken anxiety, lives continuing, even as certainty slowly eroded. The 19th century did not end this chapter with resolution. Instead, it left Virginia carrying unresolved weight, of expansion that had reached its limits, of slavery that demanded defense, and of social change that could no longer be postponed indefinitely. These forces remained in place, pressing against one another, shaping the path forward. And as time continued its steady movement, Virginia approached a turning point, not with clarity or calm, but with the heavy knowledge that the world it had built could not continue unchanged forever. Number 8. The Civil War and its lasting impact on Virginia. As the 19th century moved toward its middle years, the long-building tensions within Virginia and across the nation finally reached a breaking point. The debates that had once unfolded through speeches, laws, and uneasy compromises could no longer be contained by words alone. Virginia stood at the center of this growing storm, both geographically and historically, carrying the weight of its past into an uncertain and deeply divided present. When the Civil War began, Virginia's decision to separate from the Union was not made lightly, nor was it universally supported within the state. Families, towns, and communities found themselves divided by loyalty, belief, and fear. Some saw separation as a defense of tradition and sovereignty. Others worried about the cost, sensing that the coming conflict would demand more than anyone could truly afford. Even before the first major battles were fought, Virginia's social fabric was already under strain. Geography placed Virginia directly in the path of war. Its proximity to the nation's capital ensured that movement, strategy, and attention would center on its land. Roads that had once carried crops and travelers now carried soldiers. Fields that had fed families became training grounds and camps. The landscape itself began to change, shaped not by seasons, but by marching feet, heavy equipment, and constant presence. Life for civilians shifted quickly. Routine dissolved as uncertainty took its place. Men left homes to join armies, often with little sense of when or if they would return. Women, children, and elders were left to manage farms, households, and businesses with limited resources. Daily life became an exercise in adaptation, shaped by shortages, fear, and endurance rather than long-term planning. Enslaved people experienced the war in profoundly complex ways. For many, it carried the possibility of freedom alongside great danger. Movement of armies disrupted established systems of control. Some seized opportunities to escape when lines shifted. Others waited, watched, and listened, weighing risk against hope. The war unsettled slavery's foundations even before its legal end was declared. Cities and towns felt the pressure differently. Some became centers of administration and supply, crowded with soldiers and activity. Others lay directly in the path of conflict, enduring occupation, destruction, and repeated disruption. Familiar streets filled with unfamiliar uniforms. Buildings once associated with commerce or worship were repurposed for hospitals, storage, or command. The natural landscape suffered alongside human life. Forests were cut for fortifications and fuel. Fields were trampled or left unplanted. Rivers carried the remains of conflict downstream. The quiet rhythms that had once defined Virginia's land were replaced by constant motion and noise. Nature, like society, was pulled into the demands of war. Psychological impact ran deep. Even in places spared direct battle, anxiety became constant. News traveled slowly and often incompletely, allowing rumor to fill the gaps. Each knock at the door carried weight. Each passing day stretched nerves thinner. Time no longer felt gentle or predictable. It felt heavy, marked by loss and waiting. As the war progressed, the sense of inevitability grew. What had begun as a political conflict revealed itself as a total transformation of life. Institutions were tested, beliefs were challenged. Assumptions about permanence, hierarchy, and order began to fracture. Virginia, once confident in its identity, now faced uncertainty on every level. As you imagine this opening stage of the Civil War in Virginia, picture familiar landscapes overshadowed by tension, homes standing quietly while distant movement reshapes everything around them. Lives pause between past and future, caught in a moment that could not be undone. This was the beginning of a conflict that would not only decide political outcomes, but permanently alter the meaning of community, labor, and identity in Virginia. The war had arrived, not suddenly, but with the heavy certainty of something long delayed, and its presence would leave marks far deeper than the battles themselves. As the Civil War continued, Virginia became more deeply absorbed into the daily reality of conflict. What had first arrived as disruption now settled into a persistent condition, shaping every aspect of life. The war was no longer something happening nearby or elsewhere. It was present in homes, in fields, in towns, and in the thoughts of everyone who lived within the state's borders. Battles moved back and forth across Virginia's land, leaving few regions untouched. Roads that once connected communities became strategic routes, traveled repeatedly by armies moving in opposite directions. Fields were crossed so often that the soil itself seemed exhausted, pressed flat by boots, wagons, and artillery. Familiar landmarks lost their meaning as places of comfort and became points of tactical importance. For civilians, endurance became a daily practice. Shortages of food, clothing, and basic supplies grew more severe as the war dragged on. Trade slowed or stopped entirely in many areas. Money lost value. Barter replaced commerce. Families learned to stretch what little they had, relying on ingenuity, shared labor, and mutual support to survive. Daily life narrowed, focused on immediate needs rather than future plans. Women carried an increasing burden during this period, with many men absent. They became responsible for farms, households, and children, often while also caring for the wounded or displaced. Their labor expanded quietly but significantly, sustaining families and communities under immense pressure. Though rarely acknowledged formally, their role was essential to survival on the home front. Enslaved people experienced the war in ways that varied widely depending on location and circumstance. In areas where Union forces advanced, systems of control weakened or collapsed. Some enslaved individuals escaped when opportunity allowed, seeking safety behind Union lines. Others remained constrained by distance, danger, or responsibility to family. Even where escape was not possible, the authority of slavery was visibly shaken. The certainty that had once enforced obedience gave way to instability and fear among those who relied on the system. Military occupation altered towns and rural areas alike. Some communities experienced repeated occupations by opposing forces, each bringing new demands and expectations. Homes were searched, supplies were taken. Civilians learned to live under watch, adjusting behavior to survive uncertain authority. Trust became fragile, shaped by fear of accusation or retaliation. Hospitals and camps appeared across the landscape. Churches, schools, and homes were converted into places of care and confinement. The wounded and sick filled these spaces, bringing suffering into direct view of civilian life. Disease spread easily, claiming lives even far from battlefields. Death became familiar, no longer distant or abstract. The emotional toll of the war deepened with each passing year. Loss accumulated slowly but relentlessly. Families waited for news that arrived late or not at all. Grief was often private, expressed quietly amid ongoing necessity. There was little space to stop and mourn. Life demanded continuation even when hearts were heavy. The environment continued to bear the cost. Forests were stripped for fuel and construction. Wildlife retreated. Rivers and streams carried signs of human disruption. The land that had once supported steady agricultural life now reflected exhaustion, mirroring the condition of those who depended on it. Despite exhaustion, the war did not pause. Strategies shifted, leadership changed, hopes rose and fell with rumors and reports. Yet for those living in Virginia, the larger narrative mattered less than daily survival. Victory and defeat felt distant compared to the immediate need to endure another day. As you imagine this stage of the war, picture a state stretched thin, quiet homes standing amid altered landscapes, people moving through familiar places that no longer feel the same, time passing slowly, marked by strain rather than routine. This was the middle of the Civil War in Virginia, a period defined not by dramatic beginnings or endings, but by persistence. The war settled into the fabric of life, reshaping society not through sudden transformation, but through constant pressure. And as this pressure continued, it prepared the ground for changes that would follow, whether welcomed or feared, once the conflict finally moved toward its uncertain conclusion. As the Civil War continued, Virginia became more deeply absorbed into the daily reality of conflict. What had first arrived as disruption now settled into a persistent condition shaping every aspect of life. The war was no longer something happening nearby or elsewhere. It was present in homes, in fields, in towns, and in the thoughts of everyone who lived within the state's borders. Battles moved back and forth across Virginia's land, leaving few regions untouched. Roads that once connected communities became strategic routes, traveled repeatedly by armies moving in opposite directions. Fields were crossed so often that the soil itself seemed exhausted, pressed flat by boots, wagons, and artillery. Familiar landmarks lost their meaning as places of comfort and became points of tactical importance. For civilians, endurance became a daily practice. Shortages of food, clothing, and basic supplies grew more severe as the war dragged on. Trade slowed or stopped entirely in many areas. Money lost value, barter replaced commerce. Families learned to stretch what little they had, relying on ingenuity, shared labor, and mutual support to survive. Daily life narrowed, focused on immediate needs rather than future plans. Women carried an increasing burden during this period, with many men absent. They became responsible for farms, households, and children, often while also caring for the wounded or displaced. Their labor expanded quietly but significantly, sustaining families and communities under immense pressure. Though rarely acknowledged formally, their role was essential to survival on the home front. Enslaved people experienced the war in ways that varied widely, depending on location and circumstance. In areas where Union forces advanced, systems of control weakened or collapsed. Some enslaved individuals escaped when opportunity allowed, seeking safety behind Union lines. Others remained, constrained by distance, danger, or responsibility to family. Even where escape was not possible, the authority of slavery was visibly shaken. The certainty that had once enforced obedience gave way to instability and fear among those who relied on the system. As the state approached the present day, it carried with it a long memory. Colonial beginnings, revolutionary moments, periods of conflict, growth, and reform all remained part of the collective consciousness. These experiences shaped attitudes, values, and the way progress was understood, not as forgetting the past, but as learning to live with it. Virginia did not become something entirely new, it became something expanded, broader, more connected, more aware, yet still grounded in the same land that had shaped centuries of life before. This grounding allowed the state to move forward without losing itself. In the quiet flow of modern life, Virginia continued to be a place where history felt close, not distant. Old roads still guided travel. Rivers still followed ancient paths. Communities still gathered around shared spaces. The past did not fade, it softened, blending gently into the present. And as time continued forward, the story of Virginia remained open-ended, not rushing toward conclusion, but unfolding steadily, shaped by people who lived within its landscapes, carried its memories, and contributed quietly to its future.